Hi, everybody. My name is Alana Selkowitz, and I work on the partnerships team at Games for Change. Woo! One partnership I'm incredibly proud of over this past year is a partnership that we had with the JED Foundation. The JED Foundation is a leading national nonprofit that protects emotional health and prevents suicide for teens and young adults. The JED Foundation partnered with Raising Good Gamers, which is an initiative between Games for Change and Take This that's focused on ensuring safe online spaces for youth. We put together an interdisciplinary advisory board of experts, and then JED brought in a diverse cross-section of young people to address the question of how can the metaverse be good for youth mental health. Yesterday, a report was issued that provides actionable guidance for stakeholders in fostering a metaverse ecosystem that centers on the rights and well-being of youth. This next panel addresses some of the many questions that were explored and some of the recommendations made to help address these important issues. So, moderated by lead writer at GamesBeat, Dean Takashi, the panel includes Rebecca Benghiat, president and COO of the JED Foundation, along with some of the advisors from this project. We have Mark DeLoura, who's the founder of Level Up Games, Rachelle Vallon from Quest to Learn, and Madison Taylor from the University of California, Irvine. So please welcome our panel.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. My name is Dean Takashi. I'm the lead writer for GamesBeat at VentureBeat. Been covering games for about 27 years now. And I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Becca.
Sure. Thank you, Dean. I'm Becca Benghiat. I'm the president and COO of the JED Foundation.
Oh, that was fast.
No, we get in the meat of it. We got work to do.
That's true. I'm Mark DeLoura. I'm a longtime game developer, worked in the White House for a few years, and I've been doing ed tech for the past 8 or 9.
Hi, I'm Rachelle Vallon. I am the lead guidance counselor at Quest to Learn, which is a 6 through 12 school in Chelsea that focuses on game-like learning.
I'm Madison Taylor. I'm a PhD student at the University of California, Irvine, studying clinical psychology and specifically digital mental health.
And the JED Foundation just did this very interesting report on teens and the metaverse. And Becca, maybe just to sort of bring everybody else up to speed, can you talk about it a bit? It's 69 pages and you worked on it for a year.
Yes.
That's it, really.
That's it, right? That's the story. So at the JED Foundation, we think a lot about the systems in which young people live, focus primarily and especially originally on schools and academic systems, but also what are the other communities in which they interact and exist, and how can we think about their mental health and their safety in those communities? And so part of our work is to investigate emerging technology and opportunities for young people to understand risks and rewards. And about a year ago, knew that we needed to dive deeper in the metaverse space and reached out to Raising Good Gamers, Games for Change to launch this work.
Mm-hmm. And everybody here had something to do with it.
Yes, we were busy. So we commissioned a literature review through the Connected Learning Lab. We had a group of national experts, cross-section, 2 represented here. We had a youth advisory board, really to synthesize what we knew, because that's where we started, and then understand both the opportunities for supporting youth mental health and the leverage points. So where can we make the most change? Where can we be most supportive and lean into those protective factors, and really emphasize that in the work to come.
Mm-hmm. So we did talk to actual teens, right?
We did also talk to actual teens. We found them and we talked to them. So part of the work was a moment where we realized we needed to understand the rights of young people. So instead of prescriptively talking about what they can and cannot do or what's protective, making sure that we're centering this work on what they should expect, what do they deserve in this space. The expert advisory group came together and developed a list of rights. And I would say the sort of good news, as we shared it with the youth panel, it resonated. So there was a moment of comfort and understanding that we as an industry and cross-section industries were able to derive pretty close, some wordsmithing, getting there, but and to reflect back to young people what they agreed were their rights. So good job.
Mark, why don't you take us into the metaverse a bit, a stab at maybe defining it, or otherwise, figuring out what's meaningful about it, considering that maybe the term is falling out of fashion now.
Yeah, a little bit. I'm sorry if you've been working on metaverse for a long time. But I mean, my background, way back in the day, I worked on VR back in the late 80s, early 90s. And it was nice to see VR coming back and the metaverse. I think for the most part, we've been talking about metaverse for the past 4 or 5 years, people were talking about immersive experiences, primarily VR, AR, XR, MR, it's something R. But really, it's about the immersive experience and being able to get in there and spend time with your friends and experience things together. And I think now, as maybe it's falling out of vogue, I think we may not have created the kind of experiences we are all expecting to really come out and that everybody was going to be in there. That hasn't happened so much. But there were experiences prior to this conversation about the metaverse that were metaverse-like, and they still exist. And they're Minecraft, Fortnite, Roblox, things like this. As far as I'm concerned, those are the metaverses we have. They're places we go and you can spend time with your friends and have experiences, kind of a cross between a social network and a video game. And so everything we were tasked to talk about on this panel, I think is completely relevant to all of those experiences as well.
So nodding heads, I guess everybody sort of thinks of the here and now metaverse as some of these really big games. I don't know if anybody wants to sort of embellish on Mark's answer a bit, or what does the metaverse mean to you, I guess?
I mean, I think as an educator, I agree. And I think it really has to do with kind of any digital space, looking at social media. And I think that was, some of the key points that were discussed in coming to a decision about what we mean when we say a metaverse, as opposed to the metaverse. But I think especially in education, when we're looking at the rights of students and what they need and engaging in, positive and supportive mental health, it's important to look at all of the facets of a metaverse. So, not just XR, not just the metaverse, but social media, Roblox, Minecraft, any opportunity where young people are interacting and communicating with each other on a specific platform.
You mentioned the rights of teenagers, I guess, when it comes to the metaverse. So the metaverse is not just something that's going to happen to us. And we want it to be something, I guess. Do you want to embellish on that? Yeah.
Well, I would say one of the rights that was elevated pretty early was the right to be able to create in that space. So to participate as full citizens and be at the table. And that I think was of the rights that we identified, which also included privacy, it included the ability to express themselves in the ways that felt comfortable. So from an identity perspective, safety around data protection, right? The ability to be in that creative, future-looking space and understand that they are as participatory as opposed to having it happen to them. So I think that was exactly the focus.
So all these things we don't have now.
Well, there were, we landed on a set of recommendations, and I would say the hope of the recommendations and the way that it's been structured is to really prioritize both synergies between stakeholders and to prioritize work within each stakeholder group with the intention of having it be something that we're going to be able to shape, but also have the next steps and the deliverables. So that was the true intended. It was not the sort of let's take a look and put it on a shelf. So it's good snackable pieces to it.
Yeah, I really appreciate it about this process. I've been parts of lots of people writing, policy proposals and papers and things, and then you get to the end and you have a doc and you're like, is anybody going to read this 150-page document? So the idea that we get to the end and there's actually an end and it's like, here's are you one of these stakeholders? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Great. Which one are you? Here's a section on what you should know, what you should do. Here's potential next, acts that you could take that could forward this work. And that's the last section right before the lit review in here. And for me, that's the money for this. I'm like, I'm going to the end. What do I need? Great. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So this is one reason it took a year. I guess you guys were consulting with a lot of these stakeholders.
So it was, those Zooms where they're quiet and nobody talks, and then you're wondering, so that never happened. I don't think we ever had a moment where there was a quiet, sad Zoom moment. No, this was an opinionated.
We're all kind of.
There was, the conversations were good, and we never had that panic. So yeah, it's important to synthesize, reflect, and we were just very appreciative that we had so many different points of view and really sets of expertise at the table. So I will say it's at jedfoundation.org/metaverse for those who want to take a look, but it's intended to be usable.
Yeah, hopefully the stakeholders and the people on the board are a good representation of people who are in this room as well. And you all can find some value. You can go download it now, and you can find some value from the work of the group.
And I know you had this youth panel that was part of it too, right? The teenagers or college students, I guess. And I'm curious, what sort of impressions you got from them as far as just, they have unique perspectives as far as, generationally being different about technology than all of us, right?
So I was there for that piece, so I'm happy to reflect on that, but I think it may also spin a little bit larger to certainly classroom experiences and the research. The group of young people, 16 to 24, and that was a really interesting age set because they were both able to reflect back to when they were younger and speak about their experiences as 10, 11, 12, 13. And we asked them to look into their futures, 5 years, 6 years, to really understand what their expectations are for the space. And that was intentional. We wanted to be able to have both the look back. What would you want differently for your younger self, and what can you demand moving forward? And that was, again, not a quiet Zoom. There was not a lot of hang time there. But I don't, Rachelle, if there's sort of classroom, I imagine sort of that tracks maybe also.
Yeah, I think, one thing that I was going to mention on in terms of the youth voice when we were speaking about the stakeholders, I think I just wanted to highlight the importance of the youth voice being centered in this process and having that panel and having the opportunity for them to provide input and say, this is what we need, this is what's working, this is what's not working. And from an education standpoint, when you think about young individuals, I know this report focused on primarily 13 to 24, as a 6 through 12 educator thinking about students age 13 to 16, 17, when you think about how they're engaging in their lives throughout the day, throughout most of their experience, they are engaging in experiences that are led or dictated by adults and by older people. So to have a space that they are primarily engaging in, that they're seeking help from, going on social media, doing research on mental health supports or downloading different apps, it's important that this work have their voice centered, because oftentimes in their daily lives, their voice unfortunately is not always centered. And in a platform where they're really engaging the most, in the metaverse, looking at social media, the apps they're downloading, trying to understand what their identity is, seeking that advice, it's important that they are the voice and they have an opportunity to share, this is what's working, this is what's not working, this is what we need, this is what we're looking for, reflecting back on their experiences as young people. So I think the youth being centered was a really important piece that I think was pivotal for me as an educator in this process.
Did you get a sense that they have a different impression of the metaverse or expectation of the metaverse than adults do?
I think from an educator standpoint, I think oftentimes, and as someone who works predominantly with middle school, that is a very tough age. And a lot of, young people of middle school age are really trying to figure out who they are and where they belong. And I think that on the surface, you might hear from young people, they may say, I play Roblox because it's fun, or I play this game because I get to engage with my peers. But I think what lies underneath that and what we can pull out from them in a study like this is that they're actually engaging in a lot more when they're engaging in these spaces. It's not just on the surface, I'm enjoying myself, or I'm, having conversation with my friend, who lives next door or in the next town over. It's also, do I see myself in this game or in the people that I'm interacting with? Do I feel a sense of camaraderie or respect or safety? So I think, again, it's, getting at the heart of those things that they're looking for, and how do we foster that and uphold that, but make sure that their mental health is taken care of at the same time.
Madison, you want to weigh on some of this?
Yeah. I would say, on the whole, youth, I don't think are quite as frightened about the more ambiguous screen time as adults. Because what we found in the literature review is that screen time, just in terms of a total amount of time you're using a device, doesn't seem to be a very effective way of determining, how the youth's mental health will be impacted. It's more important to, I think, take a look at the nuances of what are they doing online? What kinds of content they're engaging with? What are the kinds of interactions we're having with others online? And those are much more influential ways of determining how the youth's mental health will turn out than just are you using a cell phone for 3 hours versus 4 hours a day? So I think youth are less concerned about that. I think youth are very concerned about equity. I think they're really concerned about hate speech and extremism online. I think those are things that are really important values, kind of moving against hate speech and more towards equity and promoting diversity online, that I think lots of youth have considerable mental health concerns about, and it really does seem to be impacting their mental health online, especially if we're thinking about LGBTQ+ youth who are experiencing lots of hate speech in those areas. So I would say definitely a lot more focus from the youth who are concerned about nuances in terms of negative interactions online. Probably about the same concerns with data privacy as adults, I would say, too. They're definitely kind of worried about what their data is going to be used for. They're a little hesitant about what kinds of research or algorithms are doing behind the scenes on their content as well. So I would say that's the main difference, is that they're less frightened over screen time, and they have these more very specific concerns about their interactions online.
Does anybody have an impression of how good a job we're doing at protecting them from bullying or toxicity?
You start? No. You start.
I think the answer is very good, right?
Awesome. Why are we here? Everything's perfect. I thought the screen time thing was interesting, just because the U.S. Surgeon General had a report that came out, and one of the things in there was if somebody has screen time of more than 3 hours, they're maybe more prone towards eating disorders. I think that was the thing they called out in the Surgeon General's thing. And then kind of looking through our research, we were like, the thing that really stuck out for me was, kind of what you just said, is it's not about the screen time. It's really reminiscent of the same sort of situation in ed tech, where we're like, well, it's not about the screen time. If it's active screen time, that's one thing. If it's passive screen time, that's one thing. It's the same in this situation.
Yeah.
What are you doing is what matters.
Yeah, I think the screen time thing's also really interesting too, and that lots of the research that's been done so far is more cross-sectional, correlational. You're just looking at the association between youth mental health and screen time at a given point in time, maybe 2. So of course you can't really determine what the directionality is very clearly from that kind of simple research. Is it that youth who are using these spaces more are going to be negatively impacted by those spaces in ways that will harm their mental health? Or is it that, which we also know, youth who are experiencing anxiety, depression, all these different kinds of mental health concerns might just be feeling more avoidant or withdrawn, and then thus spending more time online too. So it's really hard to disentangle that from cross-sectional correlational research, which is what has made up the basis of research so far. We're getting a bit better at going into more idiographic, real-time, longitudinal studies to kind of tease those apart a bit more, but there's probably some sort of bidirectional effect. The question is how much, and for what you specifically might be more vulnerable.
Well, and certainly the interventions track in real life or online, right? So the ideas of what are the life skills that we want young people to have in those interactions? How do they protect themselves? How do they understand the contents of the scenario in which they're engaging? And recommendations to not do something never quite go as well as recommendations to do something. Telling young people not to do a thing is not, that hasn't worked for me. So having social relationships, interactions, sharing with family and having connection are protective in ways that we know for certain young people finding those connections online is as protective and remarkably important for their sense of community and identity. So a lot of the recommendations that we have for caregivers and for young people are to think about how we integrate those life skills. They need some modification in the metaverse. What does it mean to interact and develop a level of awareness and savvy in those circumstances? But it's not different than what we've been asking previous.
Mm-hmm. Are there some conclusions that are worth calling out for game developers?
Yeah, lots of them. And one jumps to mind today. In particular, one of the conversations we have in game development a lot is how do we age gate things? We've had the ESRB for a long time, and we've tried to age gate things mostly on self-selection. Are you under 18? Yes or no? Of course. Over 18. That doesn't work so well. When you're talking to policy people and regulators, that really doesn't go over that great. So there's been a conversation around how we might try other things and not be too intrusive. But so the reason this is interesting today is ESRB. I don't know if you saw the ESRB thing today. They got, I think, approval to do a study on using a camera to identify the rough age of a person. This brings up all sorts of other questions, but it's super interesting. So Pat Vance and ESRB, they posted about this on LinkedIn. I'm sure you can find it in other places, but as a potential tool in the arsenal of things that we could use, this is interesting. Of course, there's lots more things for developers too. You should look in the paper.
One of the recommendations, generally we're looking at where the stakeholders intersect. So thinking about research and developers and funding. How are we able to collect and look at data and conduct research? What are the recommendations? How do they inform regulation? And where are we impacting youth? Who are the direct players? So if youth have their community of caregivers, school, educators, peers, they have a set of interactions that can be in the moment and direct. There are other stakeholders, developers, platforms, right, that regulation that impact that ecosystem and actually can have very direct connection to young people. So where are those levers that we cannot look specifically to anyone? No one's causing the problem singularly, and there isn't one fix, but it really is it's the ability to have that collaboration and look to each other to inform those steps. That's really at the core.
So I guess it would have been wonderful to have done the report 4 years ago too, before the pandemic, to figure out what a baseline was and how much things have changed because of the last couple years of pandemic, right? And to me, one of the big changes was just everybody talking about addiction before the pandemic, and then during the pandemic, talking about how wonderful it was for games to bring people together and socialize when they couldn't be together in person, right? And so we did a 180 basically on whether games were good for us or not.
Well, I think that points to the complexity, right? I mean, that exactly outlines why this is more than an easily solvable issue, because there are folk for whom risk factors are high generally, and their interactions look different and their engagement can look different. And that is perhaps less protective, more protective than other folks who are finding that community, et cetera. So I'm imagining that tracks pretty closely.
Mm-hmm. How do you guys feel about the last 4 years in that respect too? Did your own views on this do a 180 as well?
Yeah, I mean, as you were talking, Rebecca, what I was thinking, from an educator standpoint, just as an individual coming out of, the height of COVID, I think what's powerful about this work, it's not just, looking at what youth need to support their mental health in a metaverse. I think this applies to a real, an a real world IRL experience, you know, especially coming out of COVID, you know, as someone, as I'm sure a lot of people have experienced as well, dealing with anxiety, dealing with getting back to whatever normal is, and thinking about what are the things that we need as individuals coming out of COVID. You know, what do we need to feel safe? What do we need to build community? And as an educator, participating in remote learning and engaging students as a guidance counselor, I was, you know, engaging in counseling sessions virtually, which is a completely new experience. And I remember having conversations with young people to encourage them to stay in contact with each other, speak to each other. And they would say, oh, I'm playing this game and we're talking over the game. And I was like, but are you talking on the phone? And are you checking in on each other? Not understanding that that is actually a method to do that. So I think coming out of COVID, I think it just highlights the importance of this. And, you know, one thing that stood out to me is, again, the looking at the stakeholders and how they overlap. So one of the recommendations for educators is supporting parents in this work and supporting parents in training. And I think a lot of times we look at things in isolation. So as educators, you know, we are engaging, for example, in my school, in game-like learning in the classroom and supporting students in how to engage in these platforms in the classroom, and maybe having suggestions on how they're using social media or other platforms outside, but we're not bringing those, you know, two platforms together. And we're not really looking at, you know, if we're thinking about parents as partners, that also means how are we supporting parents and caregivers, you know, to support their students in what they're doing outside of the classroom. So I think all of those things really come together, and coming out of the height of COVID, I think it's even more important. I think there was a lot of, you know, time at home that students were engaging in the metaverse and games and discussing, you know, with peers that, you know, maybe was either unattended or they needed additional support in. And I think now reintegrating into the classroom space, at least, there's certainly way more room and opportunity to continue fostering that support and bringing in caregivers in that. And it's not just supporting students in the classroom, but it's supporting how they're engaging in these spaces outside of school as well. Because ultimately, as every educator knows, that trickles into the classroom.
How did you guys feel about sort of like the emergency of the pandemic and throwing kids into Roblox for 8 hours a day? And now being in a position where I guess you can be more intentional about game-like learning, like what, you know, whatever we learned or what's possible now to think about for more of the future, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the pandemic brought about a realization of one of the greatest strengths of online spaces for youth, which is that it really allows them to form these close, emotionally supportive communities with their peers. It allows them to learn how to manage conflict, other kinds of basic social skills just on a new platform that we're still learning about. I would say definitely there are, of course, challenges with metaverse-like spaces where it's less, again, about the amount of time people are using so much as it is the amount of time you're spending online impeding other areas of your life? Like, is it preventing you from, say, getting sleep, which I'm going to say is a problem for adults just as much as it is for youth too in some senses. So yeah, definitely sleep is a big one. Low sleep means that you're way more vulnerable to experiencing anxiety, depression, a bunch of other mental disorders, and these kinds of online spaces can be very distracting at times for certain. I would also say that definitely if it's impeding your academics or other areas of your life, like offline relationships a little bit, although again, lots of youth are doing a lot of things within the metaverse in terms of social interactions too, so that's just kind of a bit of a generational shift. So I would say, yeah, I think definitely because we're coming out of this whole everyone has to be online all the time, it's getting more difficult, I guess, to think about how we're going to regulate juggling these like offline behaviors, like being present in classrooms, sleeping for certain, on top of that. But there is still lots of good kind of emotional support going on there. It's just juggling.
Well, right. The one, sleep is very important, right?
Yes.
There's one takeaway here. I would say one of the rights that we landed on for youth were also their right to understand the rules of engagement. And I think that really does come out of this time of deep immersion, that they need to they have the right to clarity in the spaces in which they're participating, so that there are clear roles, clear expectations, clear ways of being with each other, and that when that is opaque or otherwise not stated, that was a pretty primary. We may have also landed on that pretty quickly. That feels like maybe one of the first of all of them. So, and for them too.
When we talk specifically about game-like learning, I think it ties back into the screen time thing. It's like, me as a developer, when I think about making a game for learning, I'm always thinking about something from a standard. Is it math? Is it civics? Is it some subjects you might learn in school, but we never really talk about the social emotional learning things that you can learn from games. And when we're talking about screen time, I think the question that I always reflect back on is, I think you're always learning something. So the question is, what are you learning? Is it a thing that was specifically designed into the game? Is it that you're learning how to be a team builder because you're playing with your friends in Fortnite? Are you learning negative behaviors that just are sort of ancillary to the experience, just come from hanging out with groups of people? And if we really want to have parents as partners, it raises a question of who's the partner when the parent isn't there. For some kids whose parents are at work, or what is the safety net built into these metaverse systems for that? So if somebody's playing more than 3 hours, it might be more likely that they're learning some behaviors that are not good for them. And if there's no parent, is it incumbent on us? Is this where regulation comes in? Is this where policy comes in? Are there developer guidelines that can help here? And to what extent do we want to be prescriptive about this kind of thing? It's like, this is where the big tangle of difficult questions comes.
Did the report call for a lot of government action and like
There's a section,
more government involvement than was happening?
There's absolutely opportunity to think about informed regulation and how are multiple stakeholders at the table, so that we are being specific in recommendations and not thinking about either platform-based or age-based restrictions solely, because that is actually not the mechanism that will drive safety in terms of youth mental health. I also, as we're thinking a little bit about additional rights, there's a piece of this too of, I lost my train of thought. All right, keep going, and then I'll come back to the rights.
You said the magic word policy. So
Policy.
Something.
Go second.
Chime in here.
I'll get there.
There's not a whole lot of policy in this space, really, right? The UK has an act, the EU has an act, California has some transparency regulation. We have conversations. So the question is, what are the policy proposals that are out there that we should be looking at? How do we push them? And I think that this report does a lot in terms of generating things to talk about. And it could be distilled down by policymakers into a set of regulations. But that work needs to be done and pushed forward.
So what?
I'll keep going. I'll guess, but I can weave it back in. No, go ahead.
So what do you recommend for a safe and healthy metaverse? Anything more specific about beyond we should pay attention and we should keep track of anything, but like what leads to a safe and healthy space, online space?
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely some things to pay attention to. I think we really haven't talked about content so far in terms of the kinds of content people can be, or youth particularly, can be exposed to online. A lot of the research, I think, was looking more towards the social media lens of algorithms and how they can sometimes rabbit hole and funnel youth into engaging with and being exposed to lots and lots of content that could be harmful to them, particularly if we think about eating disorder related content or pro-ana content, which is what is perhaps more commonly known by as youth. Or if we talk about content that's very kinds of instructional in terms of self-harm and suicidal thoughts and behaviors, I think those were some of the two big ones that popped out, where not necessarily seeing like one or two videos like offhand, but really that if your algorithm, I guess, gets the idea that you want to see these kinds of videos, you might be exposed to like a greater kind of rabbit loop of viewing more and more videos that are promoting disordered eating behaviors or self-harm or other self-injurious behaviors, and ways that I guess the youth over time, if you just see a lot of this content, you're more likely to engage in it. You're more likely to get into more extreme content, like actual videos of self-harm or like actual recipes and diets people are following that are really low calorie. And youth in particular can be really vulnerable, I guess, to peers and what their peers are doing online too. So I think that kind of rabbit holing and paying attention to those algorithms so that they're not accidentally funneling youth into experiencing and seeing more and more extreme content that could be harmful, maybe through just kind of moderating phrases, in particular like search targets, I think is like semi-effective. I managed to find my way around most of the ones on TikTok when I was looking up some content for this report. So I think it's not just that. I think it's thinking about ways to like make algorithms so that they can kind of disrupt these chains of viewing harmful content online. Maybe even thinking of ways where, say, if a youth is going on a stretch of viewing lots of pro-anorexia videos, they might get recommended some videos about healthy eating from their peers in particular. I think could be really useful because youth don't really want to be lectured by adults all the time in these spaces. So maybe allowing some of their peers who are maybe going through recovery or who have wise lessons about following those kinds of videos, having the algorithms perhaps suggest those after a while instead of more and more harmful ones could be useful. I don't exactly know how that would work. I'm much more of a mental health person, but I think that's some food for thought.
And I think really the takeaway is we need to make it easy for young people to support their mental health in these spaces. And that comes through so many different types of intervention, and that we know that those interventions are not contradicting other motivators like profit and use and right. So we can have multiple reasons to engage in a platform, and mental health can be up at the top and not to the detriment of the landscape. Things like embedding appropriate, clinically accurate mental health content into platforms as appropriate, easy, doable, reasonable, and allows for those moments of interaction where the information is proper and it's not a question of where to go, but that there isn't a contradiction, and we do not have to have supportive mental health practices separate from the rest of the ecosystem.
Are there some practical things too, like say for parents?
Right, so taking away the phone is not really super the approach, right? So, and especially because young people are finding that community often, so if they're feeling isolated, taking that away is not the solution. So what are the interventions? Sleep is wildly appropriate, necessary, and worth reinforcing. Being curious about what interactions look like, sitting down and looking at the TikToks together, sitting down, engaging in metaverse play together, having those conversations. We did a wonderful panel about a month ago for caregivers based on the findings of this report, thinking about one of the suggestions there was a tech audit. So to understand in conversation on a regular basis, any age young person, what are we using and how does that make you feel when you're using, and is that something we want to keep using? Question mark, right? And I think we could all do that with platforms that we use, but having dialogue and engagement so that there's visibility into what's happening. So those were really specific recommendations for caregivers, but I know.
Yeah, and I think going back to what I had mentioned before about the, parents and educators as partners. And I think just in general, caregivers having the opportunity to engage in education to support, how they're working with their children. So I think understanding the intersection between, technology and metaverse and mental health, I think as obvious as it sounds, I think it's important to actually educate on that intersection first as the foundation, and how this does pop up and how mental health shows up in these spaces for caregivers. And then from there, starting to build those skills, not just for the youth, but also for the caregivers as well. So what are some signs you're noticing? How do you have that dialogue, with your children about what they're experiencing, what they have access to, how that's making them feel? And then from there, how do you then get the resources, if necessary, to support what your youth is sharing or what they're experiencing?
Isn't this a difficult conversation though, right? If you're a parent, like how many of you are parents? Yeah, can you, I'm trying to imagine, so you've got a child who's exploring their sexuality and learning about themselves and finding communities. and then you ask them if you can look at their phone and make sure that they're doing it's a really delicate balance, and these are things that like none of us are trained to do as adults, and that you can totally understand why a kid would not be happy about that. But we kind of need best practices all around, like what works well, what doesn't work well, and somebody please tell us. I think this report does some of that. We need more for sure.
Would you rather talk to your kids about the birds and the bees or the metaverse?
I think you should answer that question.
I don't know.
Although, just to draw a parallel, it's kind of a similar conversation, right? Because it's not a one and done. So from what we know about sex ed, you're not ever having one birds and bees conversation. This is at different developmental stages, you're having conversations so that you are introducing concepts at age appropriate moments through a continuum, right? So you're giving trusted information over a period of time. Very similar, and that is really the analog here. And the good news is we know how to do that in other circumstances. So it really does translate. It may or may be more or less painful, but that's great.
We got about 5 minutes. Does anybody have any questions? We don't have mics, but I can try to repeat the question. Robert, yeah.
Great panel, really important. Two things I wondered if you included. One is advertisers. We know that whether it's Roblox or Fortnite, so much of the content is sponsored content that has some sort of agenda, and whether you address that. And the second are currencies. Right now, most kids are on Roblox where you get Robux, but if you go onto most metaverses, you're going to have a crypto wallet. I didn't know whether you talked about these things in the report.
Does the report cover advertising and currencies?
So advertising more than currencies, although we may have some opinions here as we dive in. So certainly young people are aware of the algorithms that drive content. And so that's the first thing I will say. And that came up in the rights conversations. And transparency and the ability to control, especially for minors, the content that flows to them through those algorithms was top of mind. And certainly advertising is a driver there. So that's baked into recommendations in a couple of stakeholder groups, right? Because there's some life skills education for young people to say this is the reality of the content that is being shown to you. Here's how it comes. So let's talk about what it means to navigate and have surfaced, right? And what does it mean to think about profit vis-a-vis mental health, vis-a-vis regulation, and the complexity, because we have different drivers pushing towards goal of views, basically. But if you want to talk about currency.
The report did not really talk that much about currency. That was more like we looked. I think it's more that there's no like really direct studies looking at youth mental health specifically in terms of currency online. I think it's definitely worth looking at in the future. I think advertising within the report was kind of drawn out through a couple different areas. I think one was in like data privacy, and that what kinds of data would platforms be collecting from youth in order to target ads towards them, and how that could be a privacy concern, especially if we're thinking about XR spaces where there might be lots more kind of bodily sensory information data there. A little bit in terms of dark patterns, where the kinds of nudges that platforms are giving to youth to keep them very involved. I think a lot of it was more focused on kind of like push notifications and other things that might cause youth to overuse or use more than they intended, especially because they're still working a little bit on like self-control and impulse control at that age. I think the most direct connection was between advertising and substance use, in particular alcohol, where it's like not terribly difficult, I think, for youth online to kind of find advertising on alcohol that really glamorizes the use of alcohol that might cause them to like binge drink or like overindulge later on. So yeah, across a couple different areas, but not much on the currency and youth mental health yet, unfortunately.
It might be great. I don't know if any advertisers like Vans, Forever 21 are on here, advisory board, but they need to hear this message also.
Do you have a last question, a quick one? Yeah. Oh, right here? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm frequently brought up a really good topic about like safety online, because we do run with like, you know, our stopping point is that are you 18 and then you can join our thing. But a lot of these people who are coming on also talk about, wow, I wish I knew about online safety and all the actual dangers of like sharing information and how much to share and all that before I got into it. I'm wondering, is there like through your study and your research, is there like some kind of like initiative to start introducing online safety in schools at such a young age? Because I feel like we can't escape that they're going to be involved in all these other virtual and metaverse experiences. What can we do to just have that actually as part of, like how we talk about sex ed, as part of like online safety? Because I feel like a lot of them are discovering that themselves or discovering it after the fact something happens.
Can start broadly, and then I know you sort of see it in application. So absolutely, this is the recommendation certainly is let's figure out ways to make spaces safer, and we need to develop life skills just like we do in terms of agency and being able to self-advocacy and awareness of your surroundings. What does that look like in these digital spaces? And how do we bake in that knowledge into those same ways that we're teaching in the classroom and in conversation with families? So there are interventions and initiatives, but one of our very strong recommendations is that needs to be even more deeply integrated into those spaces. We can't rely on platform and industry and regulation alone to create that set of life skills, and it's not that different. So those skills are adjacent to things that we talk about with young people in terms of all of the skills that we need them to understand as they grow up. But I know you're doing it.
Yeah, I think there's been a big push, at least I can speak as a New York City educator, to engage in digital literacy. But I think, again, thinking about all of these important aspects, and I think often what happens is they tend to be siloed. So education and conversation around mental health, education and conversation around digital literacy, education and support around what's happening and how youth are engaging in social media and different platforms in the classroom versus out of the classroom. And I think ultimately it comes down to certain foundational skills and how we want young people to engage and how we want them to show up and how we want them to be supported as a human being in any space, whether that is a metaverse, whether that's a classroom, whether that's at home, whether that's outside. There are kind of core aspects, I think, that need to be instilled amongst young people and that need to be demanded of all stakeholders that have a reach for all young people. But I think, for example, Common Sense Media is an amazing resource, and they provide we use it at our school for educators and for students, and they also have a number of resources for caregivers as well, in terms of how to engage in a digital space, the difference between bullying and cyberbullying, et cetera. But again, I think I can't emphasize enough as an educator the importance of starting to really look at all of this holistically. So I have lots of conversations with caregivers about support and things they need for their young people outside of the classroom that don't have anything to do with how they are showing up in the school environment. So I think those conversations are important also in a school setting, because again, how a student is engaging in Roblox at home and then maybe having an experience and then bringing that to the school community. Maybe they see a negative interaction, and especially for young people that are 10, 11, where they're trying to figure out who they are, that is going to come into the school setting because maybe they say, I'm going to try on this identity that I saw online, and maybe I'm going to interact with my peers that way in school. So I think definitely that education is important in school, but also from an education standpoint, making sure that we are bringing in caregivers and also supporting youth outside of school and not just the way they're engaging on platforms in a school setting.
Thank you very much, everybody. Great job.
Thank you.
Mhm.